Are you
Maybe
planning on ordering today, miss?
I'll have the Eagle set
How original.
with a side of tutorial.
Daring today, aren't we? With Nihility getting more love and recognition recently, it's becoming quite apparent that before the tutorial mission starts is a pretty stupid Lightcone. A Lightcone I would put on the same tier as Dance 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 in terms of value, and as time progresses, it's only going to get more value. Many Nihility units want it, but there's only one copy. This stupid Lightcone is without exaggeration the best and worst thing that Nihility has received. For some characters, it's genuinely game-changing, to a point where, just like Acheron, it feels like the entire path is being balanced around it. And while Tutorial's very existence has shaped the path since the start of the game, it's never really had a chance to shine because there just were enough units who could fully abuse it until more recently. So let's go over the history of Nihility and see where Tutorial fits in. We'll also take a look at the path from a design perspective to understand why this Lightcone feels like a must-have for certain characters. With that said, let's get right into it. In my opinion, there's been 3 distinct eras of Nihility, each defined by a different design philosophy when it comes to how their ultimates and debuffs were handled. Starting with the newbie days back in 1.x when everybody was figuring out the basics of the game, Nihility at the time didn't really have that much of a presence, with there only being 2 relevant choices in that era, that being Pela and Silverwolf. Between these two, Pela was by far the better option. Silverwolf on the other hand exposed 2 of the core weaknesses of Nihility as a path, that being uptime and the debuffs themselves. You see, unlike buffs, debuffs are inherently harder to use as they are 1, generally determined by the enemy's turn, and 2, are applied on the enemy. This leads to 2 specific scenarios where Nihility gets completely shafted. The first is where the enemies are too fast or your team is too slow, causing the debuffs or even dot damage to expire before doing much damage. And second, when you transition between waves or when new enemies spawn mid-fight, as most debuffs don't carry over. While more modern units such as Cypher or Jiaoqiu have circumvented this particular issue due to their mechanics, Nihility at a baseline will likely always have this issue. Because of these 2 flaws, early Nihility mains realized the value of speed and energy. You needed speed to keep up with the enemies, and you needed energy to maintain uptime on your ult, since most debuffs were tied to it. Now, where does Tutorial come into play? Well, it actually didn't have too much of a presence at that time. This is because the primary user of said Lightcone, Silverwolf, was honestly pretty bad at that time. Her ult uptime was poor, even when running an energy regen rope, not to mention how it only affected 1 enemy at a time. As such, Tutorial for her, rather than being a luxury, felt more like a crutch to make her even viable. This theme of Nihility being held back due to energy is something we'll continue to see, primarily in our dot units. This early era of Nihility from 1.0 to 2.1 with Black Swan was in my opinion characterized by low uptime, whether it was due to ult cost or debuff duration. While Tutorial could fix some of these issues like for Black Swan, giving your main DPS a utility Lightcone was just not the move. Moving into the second era with 2.x, Harmony was dominating the meta. As such, I believe there was a drastic shift for Nihility units. 100% ultimate uptime wasn't just a luxury anymore, it just became the baseline. And everything changed when Acheron was released. It wasn't just about ult uptime anymore. The question now was whether or not you could spam ults, as the new goal was to get as many stacks for Acheron as we could. With Jiaoqiu, we started to see a bit of a shift in design philosophy with him having a very low ult cost, but more importantly, having debuffs being essentially tied to his own turn. As such, Jiaoqiu did not require tutorial. While some future characters would follow suit with their unique mechanics, others would still be tied to tutorial. Now, even with the adoption of double Nihility due to Acheron's introduction, tutorial still wasn't being used too often. This is because Acheron's 2 main supports at the time were Jiaoqiu and Pela. And as you know, Jiaoqiu didn't need tutorial, and Pela would use pearls instead. But that's enough about Acheron and our Nihility debuffers. What about Dot? How were they at this time? Now, because Dot was relatively strong compared to the content, people didn't really focus on their flaws. But as time progressed and the Dot archetype fell behind as they didn't receive any new supports for a year, Black Swan weaknesses became more apparent than ever. Black Swan, like OG Silverwolf, exhibits the worst flaws in Nihility. Her ultimate only lasts 2 enemy turns, and with a 120 energy cost, maintaining high uptime is a constant struggle. Due to this, she not only cannot deal with multi-wave content as Epiphany does not transfer, but she can also struggle against fast enemies, which in theory should be Dot's best matchup. Because of this, she ideally runs tutorial, but she can't really because she's the damage dealer. So it's either cooked damage or cooked uptime. It's a lose-lose situation. Please buff Black Swan, Hoyo. Moving on, we got a little mini arc with Nihility, or what I'll call Era 2.5, featuring Fugue and Cypher. Here marked another shift in how Nihility was being designed. Instead of being overly reliant on their ultimates like past units, these two, however, had their power built into the other parts of their kit. For Fugue, her Exo Toughness, Super Break Multiplier, and also her Omni Toughness buff was all outside of her ult. Cypher, while having a very impactful ultimate, doesn't have the issue of uptime. Her damage recording and vulnerability debuff are always active, even without her ulting. Her ult is just there to deal out the damage. Because of that, neither Fugue or Cypher really needed tutorial as their kits just weren't built around constantly ulting, unless you had E2 Fugue, you know? And then came Era 3, where suddenly everyone and their mothers wanted tutorial. So why is that the case? Firstly, Silverwolf got a buff, which for the first time in a long while, she was actually very strong. At this point, she was still the only true main user of tutorial, but now with her improved kit, she could reliably 2-turn ult with just a basic in skill, or even 1-turn ult with E1. This was of course huge for her, but the thing is, nothing about her buffs actually addressed Nihility's core issues, that being uptime and debuff duration. The Lightcone was still essential to her gameplay and identity, so while these buffs made it easier for Silverwolf to function with tutorial, they didn't fix the root problems that made her needed in the first place. At the same time, Kafka also got buffs, with the change we'll be focusing on being her extra follow-up attack. This significantly improved her rotation, with Kafka now being able to reach a 3-turn ult fairly consistently. However, people realized, hey, why not just give her an ER rope, planer, and put tutorial on her? Well, people did and found out you can get a 1-turn ult with some stipulations. Now, after all the math was done, it became clear that this with Eagle is Kafka's highest performing build, assuming you can get that 1-turn ult. However, unlike Silverwolf, who needs tutorial to function well, Kafka isn't reliant on it. Instead, she's just really incentivized to run it if you're trying to maximize your damage. Her standard build with Pain is still competitive and also easier to play. So tutorial isn't mandatory, just optimal in high investment setups. But why were people even entertaining this idea to begin with? Isn't Kafka still a majority of Dot's damage? Well, it's because of the next addition to the Dot roster, High Sealants.
Call me High Sealants.
Who with Black Swan will be the majority of Dot's damage, relegating Kafka as more the Dot procer of the team. Now, when looking at High Sealant's base kit and the major version 3 buffs, we can still see that there's still a bit of downtime in a rotation. Sure, you can run an ER rope to get full uptime by being very SP negative, or settle with 3/4 uptime but be more SP positive. But it's still kinda meh. But you know what fixes this dilemma? Yeah, you guessed it, tutorial with ER stuff. But because High Sealants is dealing so much damage for the team, it's actually kinda throw. And this is where the dilemma comes in. We know it's possible to have full uptime or be very SP positive via tutorial, but it's just not ideal doing so. And that's where this video idea came from. Though it's not explicitly stated that Nihility is balanced around this Lightcone, it just feels like it. In the same way that Acheron's mere existence probably has placed some limitations on how strong a Nihility character could be. On the other hand, most Harmony characters generally just need an energy recharge rope for clean rotations, and they usually don't need a particular Lightcone to feel playable. The only Harmony unit that actually struggles with energy is Robin, but that's because she's balanced around follow-up attack teams for energy, not because she's reliant on some Lightcone to function. And it's at this point where I'm thinking, perhaps there's a reality where tutorial never existed, and our Nihility characters would have lower ult costs or at least not dookie uptime. Now that we've covered tutorial and its impact for our Nihility characters, I just want to pivot a little bit and talk about some major issues with this path, excluding energy and ult reliance. That being, Nihility as a path is a nightmare to build and balance. When looking at traditional DPS characters, we just need to build attack, create crit damage, and some speed. A Harmony character just needs an energy recharge rope, their scaling stat, some speed, and HP and defense if you feel like it. A Nihility character, however, needs attack, sometimes crit rate and crit damage, speed, effect hit rate, and energy recharge. There's just so much stats that you need that it just feels awful to build around. A prime example of this is Welt. Sure, you can go the traditional crit stuff, but then your ult probably isn't imprisoning, nor are you getting it often enough for it to even matter. And at that point, why not just use a normal DPS with higher multipliers? And of course, you could go speed, energy recharge, effect hit rate to make your ult useful, but then your damage drops off a cliff. Every Nihility character besides Fugue has offensive attacks for their skill and ultimate. So when you have that 550 crit ratio, it just feels like you're wasting your potential. Nihility should be the sub DPS archetype, but instead, they're treated like debuff and Acheron bots. They're getting mugged by Harmony units in terms of damage when most of them don't even attack. For Dot, sure, you have one less stat to build, but because Dot in general has poor uptime, you gotta decide to sacrifice your uptime for damage, something that most DPSs never have to compromise. Not to mention that when you do have an all-offensive Nihility team, such as Dot, you actually have the same HP as a group of baby Saurians that happen to come across the Traveler. Now, excluding Dot, who I do believe should have improved uptime, it does make sense why Nihility main and some DPSs are getting shafted, whether it's effect hit rate needs, poor uptime, or just weak multipliers. And that's because if this wasn't the case, they'd probably be very strong, perhaps a bit too strong due to their utility. Now let's imagine a world where Silverwolf and Archer had nearly identical kits and did identical damage, but Silverwolf also had defense shred too, with no drawbacks. Well, sure, for hypercarry it's not the biggest deal, but you put that on a team full of sub DPS supports, then it's probably a bit too strong. And seeing how more supports and sustains are contributing damage nowadays, this dilemma would just be further reinforced. We can even see it now with the current Silverwolf, who with her high ult multiplier can absolutely be played as a main DPS enabler. Of course, they could balance it by being smart with the numbers, but hey, the point still stands. To finish off this video, I will give a quick list on how Hoyle could fix this issue for older or even future characters, or like rules in general. Buff Flex 1, primarily uptime or ult cost, buff Jiao Cho cause he deserves it. Now for characters in general, Nihility main DPSs ideally do not need effect hit rate at all or have a very low effect hit rate requirement so they can focus on DPS stats. If they do have amping debuffs like Death Shred or Vulnerability though, their multipliers need to be lower to compensate. Sub DPSs and supports need lower ult costs or higher duration in general, and also relatively low effect hit rate needs so they can still build the stats they want. Sub DPSs should also have lower multipliers so they don't become main DPSs with utility. Supports ideally have debuffs that carry over and the other stuff I mentioned for sub DPSs. Now, Hoyo can do the effect hit rate to some stat conversion, but it's just the same thing with extra steps. Sure, if the conversion is worth it like Kafka, fine. But if not, let's just cut out the extra steps. If they don't want to do that, just make the characters less ult reliant and put more power into the other parts in their kit like Fugue or Cypher, which solves all of that. Okay, TLDR, the perfect Nihility unit is Triby. Good damage, debuffs on her own turn, high uptime on ult if you play it right, can use her signature Lightcone for really high ult uptime but not needed at all, and has high HP so she doesn't die. Yeah, who knew? The perfect Nihility character is just a harmony one. Okay, but jokes aside, I hope you get the point. One last thing, for future units, if your ult has a debuff like Silverwolf or Pela, please make it a 2-hit attack like Welt, so the first one applies the debuff and the second hit is amped so we get some nice numbers. Okay, and that's the video. I'd love to hear what y'all think about the tutorial or even Nihility itself, because there's probably a lot that could be said. Now, I don't really have too many more comments besides to check out my livestream coming up soon. I hope this video was a fun watch and I hope y'all have an awesome day. Peace!